Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book. And in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 58 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Why do we refer to the men who founded the United States as the Founding Fathers? Why do we choose to remember the American Revolution as a glorious event that had almost the universal support of Great Britain's North American colonists, when in fact, the Revolution's events were bloody, violent, and divisive? Today, we explore our memory of the American Revolution and how our memory of the event and its participants evolved with Andrew Shockett, author of Fighting Over the Founders, How We Remember the American Revolution. During our exploration, Andy reveals what historical memory is and how historians study it, how presidential candidates have and do evoke events of the American Revolution and the Founding Fathers, and details about how books, TV shows, movies, and historic sites depict the American Revolution and the founding generation. Are you ready to go back in time and see how our present-day memories of the past have been shaped? Let's go meet our guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today's guest historian is a professor of history at Bowling Green State University. His research and teaching interests include early American cultural history, the American Revolution, and Atlantic history. On his website, he describes himself as a budding digital humanist and an all-around good guy. Today, he is here so we can discuss the ideas in his newest book, Fighting Over the Founders, How We Remember the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Andrew Shockett.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Liz.
Andy, on your website, you describe yourself as a budding digital humanist. Would you tell us what a digital humanist is?
Sure. Well, some of your listeners may be familiar with the digital humanities, some not. Basically, when we talk about the digital humanities, we usually mean one or more of three things. Using computer methods to answer questions about the human condition. So, again, using computers to answer questions that we've been thinking about for a long time. Using the questions of humanists, like historians and philosophers and literary analysis, and applying them to how we live now in a digital age, an age of computers, or using computers or digital methods to disseminate our scholarship in new ways. So, early Americanists are doing these things in all sorts of ways. For example, the Transatlantic Slave Database website, which allows us to answer who came across the Atlantic, when, and from where, or, for that matter, podcasts and blogs, new ways to distribute information and to have conversations. And I say budding because I'm really an amateur. But one of the things, for example, I'm participating in is a project with Billy Smith together with McNeil Center for Early American Studies called the Magazine of Early American Datasets, to preserve and make available datasets that have been compiled by historians of early America for other scholars or just the public to use and explore.
Do you think computers have made historians more statistically minded?
I think more it's maybe made those of us who may be statistically minded, it gives us more tools and methods to be able to ask and answer those questions that may involve large sets of data or corpuses of text or something in ways that we weren't able to before, which is pretty exciting.
It is exciting. Before we dive into fighting over the founders, did being a budding digital humanist help you write your book?
It did in some sense. I mean, I for many years, even before I was in academia, I did some things with databases and computers. And so there were things, and we may talk about them later, having to do with, for example, how I analyzed speeches, that I was able to use tools that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do, and for that matter, how to analyze some of the books that I analyzed using some of those methods and tools. So that was pretty cool to be able to do that.
And I'm sure we will discuss it, but before we get there, we should probably discuss the context of your book. Andy's new book, Fighting Over the Founders, How We Remember the American Revolution, is not a history book of the Revolution, but an exploration of how we remember the American Revolution. Andy, would you help us better understand what historical memory is and how historians study it?
Sure. I would characterize historical memory just as how we as a society preserve, discuss, portray, debate the human past. So for the historical memory of slavery, if a historian were to try to analyze that, a historian might look at movies that portray slavery and the debate about them among critics and the public, historical sites that portray slavery. They might survey people to find out what they know or think about slavery. So it can be in all sorts of different contexts, this thing about how we portray, debate the past.
One last thing that we should probably understand before we get into the heart of fighting over the founders is that as Andy explores the historical memory of the American Revolution, he uses two distinct viewpoints that present-day Americans use to remember the past: essentialism and organicism. Andy, would you tell us about these points of view and how they help us better understand our memory of the American Revolution?
Sure. These were 2 points of view that it wasn't, when I started, it wasn't as if I had this idea that there were these 2 points of view, and then I found it was more the other way around, especially looking at political speeches is where I first sort of realized this was going on. By the way, these are both ways of, each of these that I'll describe as both a way of looking at history in general, as well as a particular kind of interpretation of the American Revolution. So what I describe as essentialism is the view that the American Revolution was a glorious one, mostly protesting taxes and tyranny that reinforced principles of national independence and personal liberty, maybe God's plan, and that in terms of history, that history has one clear truth that we can know, that's eternal, that we can know if we just read the documents, it becomes evident to us. Organicists, on the other hand, believe that there are many pasts, that the past is open to interpretation, that those interpretations may change over time, and that the American Revolution, while successful, was an unfinished revolution, especially in terms of equality. And now both of these views are, I should say something about both of these. One is that this is sort of a spectrum. There are people can be at one end or the other or somewhere in between. Even individual interpretations can vary, and also that both are often useful. People use them as ways to see the past, but neither one is necessarily a more accurate view of the American Revolution.
Sure, they're just different points of view about the American Revolution.
Right.
Let's take a look at how you use these points of view in fighting over the founders. Andy studies the memory of the American Revolution in 6 different areas: presidential candidate speeches, books, museums and historic sites, movies and TV shows, the politics of the Tea Party movement, and reenactors' reenactment of the period. Andy, earlier you mentioned that you use databases and computers to help you research the language used in presidential candidates' speeches. Would you tell us about your research and how often candidates mentioned the Founding Fathers or the people and events of the American Revolution?
Sure. Well, I enjoy following politics, and when I first started, I thought, okay, well, I'll just gather all the speeches I can and read through them all. And then I realized, okay, 435 members of Congress, 50 governors, presidents. There's no way I could do that. And so I figured, okay, so how would I get the range of mainstream political speech in the United States? So what I decided to do was focus on the primary candidates in presidential elections from 2000 to 2012. And I gathered the text of speeches from candidates' websites, from various news sources, from a few websites that aggregated some of these speeches, and I put them all into a database. And that was about 7 million words. And while I enjoy listening to speeches, I didn't really want to read several thousand candidate speeches. So what I did was I put them into that database, and then I was able to search for words and phrases having to do with the American Revolution, and then see by election who was using these phrases, by election, by candidate, by party. And it varies. It's very idiosyncratic. It very much varies by some candidates like to talk about the revolution a lot and some less so, and it even sometimes by election. But at least in the speeches that I looked at, politicians were bringing up the American Revolution between a quarter and a third of their speeches.
Did you find that candidates from one party mentioned the American Revolution more than another?
Even that varied by election. I thought, well, maybe it's the party in power or out of power, or maybe it's someone who's run before versus not. And I couldn't find any specific pattern that way, that one party was using the American Revolution more than others. What I did find, though, was that candidates in one party tended to use particular phrases a lot more than candidates in another party. For example, Republicans were highly likely to use the phrase Founding Fathers, whereas Democrats were much more likely to use created equal or to form a more perfect union.
Does the usage of those words lend themselves to the essentialist or organicist viewpoints of the revolution?
I think in some ways they do. And as I mentioned earlier, it was looking at the speeches that sort of clued me into this ideological difference in how we look at the American Revolution. So when you think of Founding Fathers, Liz, what do they look like?
White men.
And who are they?
Yeah, they're pretty wealthy.
And pretty well-to-do ones.
Correct.
And we call them bigwigs because, and this is, as you know, an 18th century term for people who could afford to have more hair in their wigs, right? So, so it conveys a very positive view of a few heroic white male leaders who led the revolution. And the terms created equal, and especially to form a more perfect union, which is, of course, from the Constitution, which the Democrats use a lot, implies something very different, that rather than our founding generation coming up with a perfect structure, it implies that their work is not completed, that there's still a lot to do.
Did they tie their messages and their uses of these terms in with their political platform?
Sometimes it tends to be more explicit with Democrats than with Republicans in terms of using those phrases and tying them to specific policies, but that certainly can be the case.
That's fascinating. Now that we've seen how politicians use and try to evoke the memory of the American Revolution, let's turn to how authors remember the revolution in their books. Andy, how does the American desire to remember the revolution through organicist and essentialist viewpoints affect the writing and publication of the history books we read?
I think it might affect, in some ways, the publication more than the writing, although I do think it affects the writing more than a lot of us as historians acknowledge, because as historians, a lot of us were taught, I certainly was, to submerge or not admit that we all do have politics and ideology, and we were supposed to just tell the story and absent ourselves from it. But of course, we do all have political ideas, and those do seep into our writing, whether we choose to admit it or whether we try to hide it. So certainly our ideology affects how we write. But I think even more, you're right that it does affect publication in that the books that have sold the best, especially books like John Adams by David McCulloch or Joseph Ellis's American Sphinx about Thomas Jefferson, the books that really, really sell, that the commercial presses push a lot, tend to be essentialist biographies. Not always, but those are the ones that seem to sell the best. And authors who can produce those one after the other, and for example, like Joseph Ellis, who's a marvelous writer, he's become a franchise for a publishing franchise. Major publishers know that his books, or someone like David McCulloch's books, they sell.
If publishers are publishing books with essentialist views of the American Revolution, meaning that the author of these books portrays the revolution as a glorious event, it must tell us that Americans in general want to remember the American Revolution that way. Do you think that's true, Andy?
Yes and no. I think publishers are among the worst in the entertainment industry at knowing exactly who buys their product. So unlike, say, Netflix, where they know who watches, where they know exactly what you're watching, right? Publishers don't have a very good idea necessarily of who buys which books or why, but at least anecdotally, it seems like the audience for those books, well, let's just say that there's a reason why those books tend to sell really well around Father's Day. It seems like the audience for a lot of those books are fairly well-educated white men. So it's true that those books sell a lot. I'm not sure that we can generalize it to the entire population, because I have a feeling that it's one particular population that tends to buy a lot of those books, although, again, we don't have any good evidence. It's more anecdotal.
In addition to seeking out how we remember the revolution in political speeches and books, Andy also went on a quest to explore how American museums and historic sites interpret the history of the American Revolution and the founding generation. Andy, would you tell us about your quest? What types of museums and historic sites did you visit? And where did you look for our historical memory in those museums?
You called it a quest. Wow, I like that. I spent about a month in the summer of 2011, a little over a month, visiting around, it was about 43 sites on the Atlantic seaboard. I spent most of my time in Philadelphia looking at Independence Hall and a few other sites there, like the first president's house, but also went to the Boston area a few days. I hit Monticello and which is Thomas Jefferson's house, and Mount Vernon, George Washington's house, Colonial Williamsburg, Yorktown. Basically, when you think of the biggest hits that parents drag their kids to learn about the nation's founding, that's where I went. And I observed everything I could, exhibits, film, the introductory films that they show, tours, the visitors. And I freely admit that the chapter I wrote this was a lot more impressionistic than methodical, in the sense I didn't do surveys or extended interviews to look at audience reception, but I was trying to experience those sites as tourists would. And that's sort of what I was looking for. What's the experience of going through these different sites?
Fantastic. I have found a kindred spirit, Andy, because I am someone who regularly takes my family members on vacations that have names, like the French and Indian War Tour, Highlights of Historic Virginia, or the Northern Boundaries of the War of 1812 Tour. As someone who does this, I found your chapter on museums and historic sites to be really interesting. And one aspect of the chapter that I found fascinating was the fact that you mentioned that many museums and historic sites face interpretive challenges, in that sometimes their funding hinges on the way that they decide to interpret the American Revolution. Andy, would you discuss this a bit more?
Sure. What I found, and I'm not I'm far from unique in finding this among scholars who look at historical memory, especially of these kinds of sites, is that they're no less a battleground for the memory of, in this case, the American Revolution than political speeches, although, of course, in a lot more subtle and conflicting ways. For example, most sites, they tend to lean essentialist or organicist, but they all have a range of programming. So Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, is mostly essentialist, and in fact, its introductory movie was very much designed, according to even the director of the museum, to make Washington into the nation's first superhero. Monticello is much more organicist. In fact, I was back there again this summer with my family, with our girls, which is a totally different experience. But the first thing that visitors from the parking lot see is a sign advertising Monticello's Slavery at Monticello tour. But even then, so they have a slavery tour, but the house tours in Monticello mostly downplay slavery and play up Jefferson's greatness. Just like at Colonial Williamsburg, there's programming that emphasizes the heroism of white revolutionaries and programming that explores the lives of women and the enslaved. So there's really a wide range, and it really affects how people and kids think of it, but also in terms of affecting funding. This is something that a number of scholars have looked at, like Gary Nash has written about the Liberty Bell site, or Ari Kelman writing about the Sand Creek Massacre site, or Kirk Savage writing about, for example, the Vietnam Memorial site. These are, we're very passionate about our history as Americans, but the thing that happens with these sites in particular is that even if broadly as Americans, one of these sites may not be greatly controversial, there will always be small constituencies that are very vocal and very passionate and can really push interpretation in one way or another through leverage in newspapers, their members of Congress, and organizing and so forth.
Earlier, you mentioned that publishers aren't necessarily the greatest judge of what history the American public wants to read. How does Hollywood fare? There have been a number of American Revolution-themed movies and television shows. So what do you think of Hollywood's portrayal of the Revolution and the founding generation?
It's interesting because Hollywood is a conservative institution made up of liberals. So, we have this image of Hollywood stars and so as being very liberal, but a lot of times the way they tell their stories is in very conservative ways. And, of course, any movie is a big group project with a lot of voices and a lot of competing concerns. And so movies can have a lot of different elements in them. And one, for example, that I wrote about is the Patriot. By the way, the Patriot, most historians hated the Patriot, and for a lot of good reasons. Its portrayal of race is in some ways really appalling, although maybe we shouldn't be surprised now that we know more about Mel Gibson and his racial attitudes. But it also makes the English into villains and the rebels into good guys. And historians, a lot of us are all sort of suspicious of happy endings in the first place. But there's also a lot in that movie that we can learn from. It's perhaps the only movie that shows the violence and the rage of war, and shows that people went to war not only out of patriotism, but sometimes for the defense of their families or just out of revenge or hatred. And that's something that we actually don't get in a lot of other portrayals of the American Revolution.
Fighting over the Founders went to press before AMC aired its popular television show, Turn, which is set in New York during the American Revolution. What do you think about Turn, Andy? Does it present the revolution through an organicist or an essentialist viewpoint?
Well, one thing I do think it's neat in that it shows that Americans were divided, that it wasn't just all Americans against the British. So that I like. And it's part of a whole wave of shows that we've had in the last few years. So not just that, but Sons of Liberty, Book of Negroes, Sleepy Hollow. And I was thinking I should write an article about it called Birth of a Genre, because I think there's a reason why we're seeing all these shows and why they have some common elements to them. I think maybe as viewers, we're getting a little tired of bad guys with fake Russian accents that don't scare us. And we've seen some shows like Remember 24 that showed anyone from the Middle East as being a bad guy. Well, one of the things about these shows about the American Revolution, sort of as a genre, the things they have in common is they have an easy bad guy. They show the British as bad guys all the time. And they have sort of a recognizable plot and some recognizable characters that are recognizable enough. So things like Sons of Liberty, that they have Benjamin Franklin or Samuel Adams, that we sort of know their names and a little bit about them, but not too much, so that the scriptwriters have a little bit of freedom to make new stories with them. So I think it's fun to have all these new shows and to watch them.
It's interesting that you brought up Book of Negroes. I heard about the book last year in Canada on my French and Indian War tour. Mm-hmm. Book of Negroes is a story about one slave's journey through the American Revolution and to freedom. It's written by a Canadian author, and the British are not portrayed as the bad guys. So, Andy, do you think that we can extend the essentialist and organicist viewpoints to all interpretations of the American Revolution, or just to American interpretations of the Revolution?
Wow, that's a good question. Yeah, and that's a really fascinating book, and it was a fascinating series. Yeah, and the series, right, produced by CBC, and then it was on BET here in the United States. Oh, and it's funny because the character played by Cuba Gooding he's shown as the owner of Francis Tavern in New York, which is still there. And I was there this spring. And they said, well, we're not so sure about that. But in any case, I think it's a little different outside the United States, just because there isn't that investment in the current relevance of the American Revolution, because for people outside the United States, it doesn't have the contemporary sort of cultural and political ramifications that it does for us in the United States.
Why do you think it's important that we should be aware of different interpretations of the American Revolution, and that the ways Americans choose to remember the Revolution do not always conform to the way the event happened?
Well, I think it's especially important in a time now where we have a country that is ideologically divided, and people tend to congregate in like communities. I think it's important that we recognize that there are these different ways, and that there are these different ways of portraying this event that we use today as sort of an ideological crutch, or sometimes an ideological cudgel in politics, and to better understand each other and to better communicate with each other, and to see that we have these perhaps equally valid or to some extent invalid points of view, rather than thinking that one group or one side has any sort of monopoly on this set of events that we use that have such cultural authority, that we appeal to as what's central about what it is to be American and what the United States should be.
I'd like to ask one more question before we move into the time warp. Historical memory is not just limited to the American Revolution. Can we take the awareness created by fighting over the founders and the organicist and essentialist viewpoints it puts forward and apply these viewpoints to other periods of American and United States history?
Well, I'd say yes and no. I think in some way, yes, in some ways in terms of how we see the past. So, and that's why I chose those terms, essentialist and organicist, in seeing some essential, unchanging past, and the other one seeing some sort of organic past that we reinterpret and that can have multiple interpretations. So, in that sense, yes. In terms of the specific events, maybe less so, because the interpretations of them can have, I guess the events are different enough that I'm not sure that I would apply those to the events themselves.
Let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In Fighting Over the Founders, I learned that Warren G. Harding is the source of the term Founding Fathers. So, Andy, in your opinion, what might have happened if Warren G. Harding had not coined the term Founding Fathers in 1912? Would the loss of that term affect the way that Americans talk about and remember the history of the Revolutionary period?
That's a great question. It certainly might have changed the language, although we, for some reason, as Americans, we tend to be pretty good at finding some sort of shorthand, whether it's for the lost cause or the New Deal or manifest destiny. We like coming up with terms that give us a shorthand. It might have been different. On the other hand, it could be that the attitudes would have been the same. So a quick story. So Warren G. Harding, he was from Marion, Ohio. He owned and edited the newspaper there, the Marion Star. And when there was a book that came out in 1913, Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, which suggested that maybe the writers of the Constitution had a financial stake in the Constitution being successful. And his newspaper, the Marion Star, the headline describing this book was, and I quote, "Scavengers, hyena-like, desecrate the graves of the dead patriots we revere." So it could be that even if we didn't have the phrase, my guess is that we'd still have the attitudes.
What are you researching and writing about now?
Well, a couple of things. One is a book on how Americans govern themselves during the American Revolution, but the longer-term thing is, the sort of bigger project is about the end of the Revolution. And this is inspired by looking around the world today as we look to so many places in the world that have struggling states, or sometimes we call them failed states, all this disorder around the world. And so my question is, why did Americans stop revolting against even their own government? Why in the 1780s and the 1790s, why did people decide that their new governments were legitimate? Why did they decide to pay taxes? Why did they decide to serve on juries and to participate in elections, especially after a revolution that was far more violent with a lot more dislocation than sometimes we think about? So how did that happen? And so that's something that I'm investigating.
Those are great questions, and they definitely need answers, so I look forward to reading your future work. Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can get in contact with you?
Sure. Well, probably the easiest way is on my website, which is andyshockett.net, and it has information about my book and some blog posts. I hope I'm not on any local post office walls, but if I am, you can look there too. So.
Andy, thank you so much for showing us that it's not just important to remember the ways that events took place, but also to remember and take note about how we remember the way those events took place.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for the service of this podcast. It's great for all of us to listen and to learn more.
Memory can be a tricky thing. Sometimes we see the events of our past so clearly, and yet when we ask our friends and family members how they remember the same exact event, they tell different stories. As Andy revealed, the American Revolution is an event that Americans remember in different ways too. And many of the stories we tell about the revolution exist because we Americans want to connect with the event in ways that resonate with us. Some wish to view the revolution as a glorious event where the founding generation fought for liberty and freedom. Others wish to acknowledge that the founders did not intend for all Americans to share in the liberty and freedom they fought for. As Andy pointed out, our collective memory of the revolution has changed and will continue to change over time as the events and circumstances of our present often influence the way we view and interpret the past. You can find more information about Andy, his book, Fighting Over the Founders, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/058. If you love Ben Franklin's World and would like to find out more about how you can join the movement to help support the show, please visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement or text Support BF World to 33444. These actions will bring you to an information page, which includes a short behind-the-scenes video about the show. Do you enjoy talking about history and hanging around other people who love history too? If so, text BF World to 33444 so you can get the link to join Poor Richard's Club, our social community for history lovers on Facebook. Finally, how do you think about and remember the American Revolution? Share your thoughts with me, Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, Never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.